What if your entire country woke up tomorrow morning and suddenly found itself completely disconnected from the US banking system? To buy the oil that powers your cities, you have to use dollars. To protect your economy from a crash, your central bank saves in dollars. When the cost of the dollar rises, the cost of your food and medicine follows. For 80 years, the US dollar has functioned as the primary default for international trade settlement. But right now, central banks are quietly shifting their reserves into other assets. The shifts occurring between now and 2026 are structural. They signal a move away from a single currency world, and that change will directly affect the purchasing power of your own bank account. This dominance began in 1944 at Bretton Woods. Representatives from around the world agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar, which was itself backed by gold. This arrangement changed in 1971. President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's link to gold, effectively removing the physical anchor that had stabilized global trade. To maintain the dollar's status, the U.S. government formed a new partnership with Saudi Arabia and King Faisal. This created the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia agreed to sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the United States provided a kingdom with military protection. Suddenly, every nation on Earth needed dollars just to keep their lights on. This provided the U.S. with an exorbitant privilege. Because the world is forced to hold dollars, the U.S. can print money and run large deficits while keeping its borrowing costs artificially low. This timeline shows the result. Dollar dominance grew through the late 20th century, eventually peaking in 2001, when it accounted for 72% of all global foreign exchange reserves. The petrodollar system didn't merely support the U.S. economy. It made the dollar the mandatory operating system for global survival. That system began to fracture in 2022. Following the invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. This sent a clear message outside the Western alliance. Your dollar assets are only yours as long as you remain on good terms with Washington. The dollar's share of global reserves has plummeted from its 72% peak to below 57%. At the same time, the expanding BRICS alliance now represents over 40% of global GDP and nearly half the world's population. U.S. sanctions turned the dollar into a perceived risk, forcing non-Western nations to find alternatives. To evaluate alternatives, we use this matrix. A reserve currency needs high liquidity, resistance to political sanctions, and a financial yield. The U.S. dollar offers high liquidity and yield, but carries significant political risk. Central banks responded by turning to gold. Its share in global reserves jumped from 13% in 2017 to 30% in 2025. You cannot freeze a gold bar stored in your own vault. However, our matrix reveals gold's limits. It provides no yield, and it is incredibly difficult to use for settling the thousands of digital trade transactions that happen every second. The Chinese yuan is another option. China developed the CIPS network to allow trade outside Western banks. But with strict capital controls, the yuan doesn't float freely, keeping it at only 2% of global reserves. Neither gold nor the yuan currently offers the necessary combination of scale and open access required to replace the U.S. Treasury market. Instead of a single replacement, we are seeing a shift toward local currencies. Today, 67% of BRICS internal trade is settled without the dollar. This creates a currency mismatch. For example, Russia now sells oil to India for rupees. Russia has billions of rupees sitting in banks, but little to buy from India. Because the rupee isn't widely used elsewhere, that capital becomes trapped and inefficient. As the completed matrix shows, the world is making a choice. Nations are trading the efficiency of the dollar for the safety of local assets. Moving away from the dollar doesn't mean finding a better system. It means accepting a more expensive, fragmented way of doing business. Many analysts suggest the BRICS nations are building a unified currency to challenge the dollar. The internal data suggests otherwise. India has been explicit about its policy. Minister S. Jaishankar has stated there is no proposal for a unified BRICS currency, and that India is not pursuing aggressive de-dollarization. Geopolitical friction between India and China remains high. India is unlikely to adopt any system that gives Beijing more control over its economic future. The limit of de-dollarization is not American power, but the lack of trust among the nations trying to replace it. This transition is a slow process, not a sudden crash. When the British pound lost its reserve status, it didn't happen in a day. It took 30 years, from the 1920s to the 1950s, for the dollar to fully take its place. This chart projects a similar path. We are moving toward a multipolar world, where the dollar share could drop to 40 or 45% by 2040. For the U.S. consumer, a lower global demand for dollars means the government must pay higher interest rates to borrow money. This will likely lead to higher mortgage rates and persistent inflation for the foreseeable future. The most important indicator to watch is Saudi Arabia. If they begin accepting yuan for oil at scale, the timeline for these changes will accelerate. The dollar's monopoly is ending. Understanding these shifts before they become mainstream news is the only way to prepare. Subscribe to stay ahead of the data.